Welcome back to Square Off. This week marks 1 year since cyber ninjas delivered their final report on Arizona Republicans' election review. The report's key finding: the endless hand count of Maricopa County's 2 million ballots cast in the 2020 election showed that Democrat Joe Biden defeated Republican Donald Trump again. But that wasn't the final word on the presidential election or the report, not even close. Joining us to talk about the report's continuing impact on our elections are two reporters who cover the story: Rachel Leingang of the Arizona Agenda and Jeremy Duda of Axios Phoenix. Welcome back to Square Off. Good to see you again. Let's start with the big picture, and this question is for both of you. Given how much more we know a year later about the people involved, what's happened locally, what actually went into the production of that report, and how our elections have been undermined. I'll start with you, Rachel. How should we view the so-called audit and more importantly, the report's findings?
To me, that report it didn't even really matter necessarily. It sowed doubt in our processes just before the next presidential election. And now there's a lot of innuendo around elections, a lot of doubt. And that, to me, was the whole point, that this put, a whole process in place that could happen again, so that anybody who loses an election can start, whatever you want to call an audit, and take a lot of taxpayer money, a lot of time, and not really know necessarily what they're doing, and it affects all of us. So,
Jeremy, how do you view it today, a year later?
I mean, frankly, mostly as a work of fiction. I mean, we saw the county's response to this, where they found that I think 74 of 75 or something like that of the so-called findings were either misleading, exaggerated, or outright false. And I think what stands out most about that is almost a year later here, the audit team, Senate President Fan, the people who led this effort, we've still gotten no real response from them about the county's rebuttal. I mean, it was extremely thorough. They pointed out things that were obviously false or obviously based on the audit team's total lack of knowledge of election policies and procedures. And we've still got, it's still crickets. We've got nothing. I've been trying this week, still no response. They won't even stand up for the alleged findings of this so-called audit.
And so one thing that stands out to me, especially in the wake of the Secretary of State debate this past week and Mark Fincham, the Republican candidate, is how this report introduced this whole pseudoscience of election study, right? Emails and all kinds of things I can't even name.
I mean, I think because elections are so complex and difficult to understand, you can really easily insert things that sound bad but mean nothing. And that's a lot of what the report was. It's a lot of what we've seen on the campaign trail in debates since then. It's a lot of throwing out something that a layperson wouldn't know and making it sound sinister. So,
and we keep seeing that. And one of the report's goals was to make our elections better in some way. Can you think of one thing that's happened as a result of that report, and be fair here, that has made or will make our elections better?
Not off the top of my head.
Really, I mean, perhaps if this had been a real audit run by credible people who actually had qualifications to examine an election, we might have learned things. I mean, election policies and procedures, you always want to work on improving these things. Something can always be done better. The more elections you hold, the more you learn about it. So if there had been genuine election professionals in charge of this, as opposed to people with no background in elections and people whose background was really as part of the Stop the Steal movement, who had been actively working to undermine and overturn the election, we might have learned some things. But as it is, I think we've really learned nothing, except for that we shouldn't really take anything about that audit seriously.
And has it made elections workers' job much harder with this pseudoscience again,
Yes.
all this stuff they've just thrown out there?
They've been hit with hundreds, if not thousands, of records requests from people seeking things that they don't even know really about, like cast vote records and things like that. They've been harassed. Many of them have quit their jobs. And that actually makes elections worse. If we have people who have experience who are leaving, what we get is people who don't know what they're doing or who have a steep learning curve on a really complex subject. And we should all be really concerned about that, I think.
And there was supposed to be an investigation of this, right? This was Karen Fann handed this off to Attorney General Mark Brnovich because there was going to be an investigation. Hopes were raised really high that there were going to be criminal charges. There were going to be indictments. What happened?
Well, I don't know. As far as I know, the investigation is still going. Mark Brnovich, a few months ago, put out an interim report, which is very unconventional and unusual for a criminal investigation, put out a bunch of kind of partial findings, none of which really actually held any water once you looked into them. As far as, I have no idea when this is going to wrap up or what's actually going to happen with this, but I mean, in theory, it's still going on.
And Brnovich was handed this hot potato as he was embarking on a run for the U.S. Senate. Did this basically end his U.S. Senate run?
Certainly didn't help. I mean, he had the challenge of governing, so you can't just say things on a campaign trail if you then also have to investigate them. I think we saw his frustration in his more recent, I think it was the day before the election in August, his report on the dead voters claims, where he basically said a lot of these people were surprised to learn that they were dead when we reached out to them. So I think there's some frustration coming through that now.
That seemed to be Mark Brnovich giving the middle finger.
And it seemed like
people.
the old him, it seemed very much like how he was before he was running for the Senate. So.
Yeah. Let's do a Where Are They Now? Because this is kind of interesting. Doug Logan, Mr. Cyber Ninja. 1 year later, where is he now? And what have we learned about this guy?
Well, we've learned that he doesn't like turning over records from the audit. We've learned that he's under some investigations in a couple of other states for similar activities. We knew that going into the audit, we knew that he'd been involved in another so-called audit in Antrim County, Michigan, that produced a widely debunked report. Now we're learning that there may have been some data breaches there. Same thing in another county in Georgia, which is I think more recent investigation. That's a bit more serious than what's going on here. Here he had, the subpoena power of this president of the Arizona Senate. So he had full access, legal access to everything he wanted. With other states, maybe not so much. And so that's a, much more serious thing when you can't just subpoena machines and throw them in a truck and drag them over to the madhouse on McDowell.
So the guy, I think it's worth reminding folks, the guy who ran this audit, who Karen Fann hired, now faces a criminal investigation in Michigan. Mm-hmm. And he also has said he's bankrupt.
I think the company is kind of defunct at this point, right? So
yeah, that's like
I don't know, because Sarasota, his base has become like the capital for election deniers. Mike Flynn's down there. You have a lot of Republicans have just moved down there for some reason, and that's where they're operating from. So this guy appears to be in real trouble. Karen Fann has been a fascinating figure in all of this. She basically, on her own, with some help from Senate Majority Leader Warren Peterson, went ahead with this election review and this report. What's her legacy?
I mean, this is for someone who's been in the legislature for a really long time. This is a really, to me, disastrous note for her to end on. She's retiring at the end of the year. And before that, it was surprising to see her sort of get involved in this kind of thing. I think, though, this will be her enduring legacy. There's nothing else that really, in her legislative career, would overshadow something that became an international fiasco.
Yeah, the cost to taxpayers has been estimated so far at about $5 million and counting because of the legal bills. And let's talk about those legal bills, because there's a big fight over public records going on, and she's been keeping them away from the public view.
She has, and she just won pretty recently a big, I believe it was the Arizona Supreme Court ruling allowing her to keep some of these records confidential, and basically declaring this is a legislative function, and that a lot of that stuff is not subject to the same public records law as other records and documents from the government. So, but there are still some that will have to be turned over, and I think it remains to be seen exactly what will be in those.
But it's truly a groundbreaking part. If you look at a legacy, that is something that could last for years. Limits on the public access to the work our legislators do in our name.
Sure, and if something like this happens again after, say the next presidential election, if the people who run the House and the Senate decided the wrong person won, then we may go through this all over again, and then we'll have some legal guidance on exactly what's public and what isn't.
So let's talk about that. There's the presidential election in 2024. We also have a midterm election coming up in November, 44 days away. Was the audit, the report, everything that's happened since, were those all dry runs, test runs for 2022 and 2024?
I think we've seen from a fair number of candidates who said they won't concede their races, and I think this is now a playbook for people who want to try to sow more doubt in elections, especially in 2024. 2022, a midterm election at a state level, I'm not sure how it'll operate there, but I think because this was a presidential context, I think it could really affect it. And certainly the legacy of the laws that may be based on this report, the restrictions on, voter rolls or on voting itself. Most of those most extreme ones didn't pass this year, but that doesn't mean they won't next year. And it kind of laid a foundation for limiting people's access to vote.
Dry run?
Possibly. I mean, again, if the Democratic candidate wins Arizona again in 2024, and obviously this is usually a pretty reliably Republican state in presidential elections, but if that happens again, and especially such a close margin, I could very much see, depending on who's in charge of the legislature at the time, I could very much see something like this happening again, especially if you see another, basically what we saw last time, which is this orchestrated effort, nationwide to spread, disinformation about the election, and that, very much filtered down here. That was very much the driver of this. I think this audit has to be looked at in the context of that larger movement to discredit and overturn the election using this information, and in a lot of cases just flat out lies as the basis. So if we see that again, which who knows, we very well might. I think, this playbook might be repeated again just in a couple of years.
And Arizona, what was the leader in 2020? I want to go back to a point you made and end on this because I think it's important to emphasize. You talk about what could happen in the next legislature in 2023 and 2024. You've got a lot of election deniers, it appears, who are going to be seated in this new legislature. What's your forecast for the fate of election laws in 23 and 24?
A lot of the moderate Republican stopgaps that were in place that prevented some of these laws from going into effect, they did not win their primaries or they weren't running again. Their replacements, at least in the primaries, were often much further right. So whatever we saw this year, which was already a lot of attempts to, limit voting, that my guess is gets way worse next year.
Yeah, I would imagine we will probably, depending on who wins the elections, the likelihood is we're going to see a very serious effort to eliminate or severely curtail early voting, which has been one of the top targets of these folks, and certainly one of the things that there was a lot of misinformation about in the audit report, alleging a lot of problems that turned out to not actually really exist, but it really reinforced these folks' belief that early voting, mail-in voting is a source of fraud and corruption and all that, which it isn't, and there's no evidence of that. But I think we will see a pretty serious push to go after early voting.
One other legacy court action: Kelly Ward and the Republican Party has sued to throw.
Thanks for watching. Check out our YouTube page for digital exclusives and more at 12news.com/YouTube.